Bonjour à tous, mon nom est Elisabeth Vallet, je suis directrice de l'Observatoire de géopolitique de la chaire Raoul-Dandurand et c'est avec grand plaisir que je vous accueille pour cette conférence midi pour discuter avec un auteur de grand talent qui est Todd Miller. Todd Miller est un journaliste et un auteur indépendant qui vit à Tucson en Arizona. Ça fait 15 ans qu'il oriente ses recherches et écrit sur les enjeux frontaliers et les communautés, notamment à la frontière mexicano-états-unienne, mais il a une très grande connaissance en fait des dynamiques migratoires venues d'Amérique centrale. Todd a écrit plusieurs livres, tous aussi intéressants les uns que les autres: Empire of Borders, The Expansion of the U.S Border Around the World, Storming the Wall, qui est à propos des changements climatiques et des migrations et de la sécurité intérieure. Border Patrol Nation, ce qui est super intéressant sur le rôle en fait de la Border Patrol le long de la frontière américaine. Et puis son dernier bébé en quelque sorte, qui est Build Bridges, Not Walls, A Journey to a World Without Borders. Il a également récemment créé un bulletin hebdomadaire, The Border Chronicle, qui est disponible en ligne et qui donne des informations très concrètes, très précises de ce qui se passe à la frontière, mais aussi des rapports, des analyses qui donnent un peu une perspective différente. On est à la fois très proche, puis à la fois on a un recul incroyable parce qu'on peut bénéficier de différents niveaux d'analyse. Alors, il tente à travers ses ouvrages de remettre en cause un peu nos idées préconçues vis-à-vis de la frontière. Donc, c'est ce personnage-là, tout un personnage que l'on accueille aujourd'hui, une extraordinaire plume. It is a pleasure, Todd, to have you today. As you know, I've said a lot of bad things about you during my introduction in French, and I've talked about this wonderful book that you've written, but like others about bridges, the fact that we need to build bridges, not walls. And I would like to maybe start with a special mention about the role of a special co-researcher you have in the name of William. And maybe I would like you to maybe start with the stories, because you're definitely a storyteller. The experience you have with your son and the way your son is looking at the border and how it changes maybe your perspective as an author. What do you think of that to start with?
Sure. I'd love to. First, my apologies for not being able to speak in French. I wish I could. And I did understand a little bit, though. I do speak Spanish, and not that I could understand anything, but I could fish out some words of your introduction. I also just wanted to say what a pleasure and honor it is to be here with you, especially talking with you, Elizabeth, and with your work that I've admired for so long. And this is my second time at the University of Quebec at Montreal, and I just really like being here, being present with you, and really I've worked with so many students, and they've all enriched me in many ways. So it's just really nice to be here with you and talk with you today. And I'd be really, really happy to start with William, my my 5-year-old now, who I just right before this, I dropped him off at kindergarten. And I do think with the book Build Bridges Not Walls, his comments to me, and I didn't even realize them at the time. Like, for example, we were about a year ago, we were at the Border Field Park in San Diego. And we for those who maybe some people know, have been there before, it's right on the beach, really. You're on the beach just south of San Diego. And that's where the border wall goes out into the ocean. So I'm sure you've at least seen pictures of it, and you just see the foaming waves coming through the wall. And when we got there, it was kind of funny because these two surfers were way out there, and they were just going from Mexico to the United States, from Mexico past the border wall. I don't know if they were purposely antagonizing the Border Patrol agent that was there, but I think I'm pretty sure they were, because the Border Patrol agent kept hitting his horn and saying, stop. I forget what he said, but he kept yelling at the surfers, but they were pretty far out there. And so, but when we got there, we noticed that you could see the steel bollard wall as we were approaching the actual borderline, and there were people on the other side of it. And some of the people, well, William started to wave, and so did then some of the people behind the wall, and that caused William to start running to go and say hi. Really, that's all that it was. And so I started jogging behind William, and the next thing we knew, we, instead of the surfers, we were the ones being yelled at by the Border Patrol agent, who hit his horn and told William not to go another foot, or not to go any further. And then William, being the 4-year-old that he is, or he was, looked up at this disembodied voice in the sky, because you couldn't see the agent, right? And then he looked at me, and then he kept running. So then the agent then did it again, and he stopped. And long story short, we ended up sitting in the sand and talking a little bit about what just happened: the Border Patrol agent, the border wall, the people on the other side of the border wall. And then he also had just learned a new word called excavator. And an excavator is one of those big machines, right? Like a bulldozer. And he said, why can't we take an excavator and crush the wall and then turn the wall into bikes? And so that I was like, well, that's a very interesting idea, William. And I wrote that down. And on hindsight, that became, I think, one of the key quotes in the entire book. I think for me and for Bill Bridges Not Wells, that quote really captures the spirit of what I was trying to do with the book. And I didn't realize it until later, right? This ability that he saw in that moment to look at the material of the wall, the steel, the bollards, and think, why are we using that for this, the border wall, and why can't we use it for something else to build a bike? And then on top of that, there's a poetic bike. Like, the bike is a free, there's, it's the freedom of movement is captured in the essence of a bike. So there's all those combinations, very symbolic, very poetic, I thought. And I think, there's other stories I could tell with William, but that one, I think it captures the spirit quite well.
Yeah, there is a picture of your son, page 56, and I won't disclose what's on the picture, but I suggest people go and check. And William is definitely a subversive activist when we look at that picture. Maybe before we go to the need to look at the world differently, I'd like you to maybe to go back in what you've done before that book, and you've done that for the Transnational Institute, which is talk about the militarization of the border and maybe the security market, which is something we don't talk about. And the report you've done for TNI is definitely pretty unique. Yeah,
a lot of the work I've done for TNI has been really about the border industry, the border market, in the sense that what I mean by that is there's a number of clusters of companies throughout the globe that are focusing more and more on building up border infrastructure, often technology, but other things as well. And I should take a step back and say that as far the research that I started really researching these topics with my first book, Border Patrol Nation. And as a part of the research for Border Patrol Nation, I went to all these conventions throughout the United States, particularly one called the Border Security Expo. And at the time when it was in Phoenix every year, Phoenix, Arizona, and since then it's gone to San Antonio, Texas, where it's been the last few years. Except it's been they canceled the one this year, and maybe I think they might have canceled last year due to the pandemic. So I just remember I like bringing up this because of at the time I didn't know what I knew that there was an industry developing around the border. I knew that there was companies getting contracts, but I still remember, first going to the Border Security Expo, for example, maybe a decade ago, and walking through those doors and seeing this just it was at the Phoenix Convention Center. You go into this big room, there's these high ceilings, and you see banners from different companies hanging from the ceilings. And it's like walking into science fiction convent. You're in this, all of a sudden you look around and there's robots crawling on the wall, on red carpets, and drones being laid out on display, and surveillance cameras everywhere, and biometric systems being displayed, and monitors where you look and you see your own face, like wow, and like guns, there's like guns everywhere, and then there's even like sunglasses and ready to eat meals and a latrine thing, and just there's just all these things, and I'm like wow, and then there's at least 100 companies. And then there's DHS and Department of Homeland Security officials wandering through, looking at all these items on display, and it's really almost like, on hindsight and thinking about this now for many years, it's like going into a crystal ball, right? It's the future. It's like the imagination of the future, and at the same time, yeah, I think it's like getting up close to what I might call an industrial a part of an industrial complex, and seeing like the interchanges between the industry representatives and the different officials, and even border sheriffs, and so that sort of research that I did for Border Patrol Nation really began what continues to this very day, right? This writing and looking at these relationships between the industry and Homeland Security, particularly in the United States, but taking on a more and more global outlook, and just investigating who are the companies getting the contracts, and there's a lot of them. How many contracts? How much money? How much clout do these companies have in decision making, really, in Washington? And so those investigations started with Border Patrol Nation, but I really have been deepened with this research that I've done over the last 2 to 3 years with the Transnational Institute, the Amsterdam-based organization, and just really looking when you look at the U.S. border, and I think this is true for borders across the world, but you look at the U.S. border, and it's just been the budgets for it have been on the rise for so long. I like to look from 1994 on, but you could go even earlier if you wanted. But 1994 is when the deterrence strategy was announced as on the U.S. Mexico border. And so I like to start there and just look at the budget and how it's grown, and from $1.5 billion in 1994 through the Immigration and Naturalization Service to this year, I think it was $25 billion if you just take Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement and put those two budgets together. So just seeing those how much these borders have gone up, the budgets and what the manifestation is in terms of personnel, in terms of hiring border patrol agents, going from 4,000 to 21,000 by 2012, and it's kind of remained there since. The building of border walls and barriers, which I believe, Elizabeth, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's around 700 miles or a little bit more of walls and barriers. Many of what were previously vehicle barriers were replaced by the Trump administration. And now you see these 30-foot high walls, like right south of where I live in Sasabe. It used to be a 15-foot wall, but it's doubled in size. And I didn't even realize that happened. I went there and it's just gigantic. So you have these, the walls and then the technologies, right? And there's been billions and billions and billions of dollars spent on technologies, which range from the surveillance towers, the sophisticated cameras, radar systems, implanted motion sensors, drone systems, biometric systems, a whole slew of things. And so I'll just name one more stat and then I'll stop there. But in between between 2008 and 2020, there have been let me see if I remember this correctly, 105,000 contracts given out by CBP and ICE worth $55 billion. And that $55 billion from those contracts in those 12 years from 2008 to 2020 is more than the cumulative collective budgets from 1975 to 2002 for U.S. border and immigration enforcement, which was $52 billion. So that stat alone at least gives me a picture of how much it's shifted, how much the budgets have grown, and how important the privatization part of it has been.
Absolutely, and you've traveled the world and crossed many borders, and we see in your book that it's not only the U.S. Mexico border, but you've also been in Morocco, for instance, right?
I have, yeah. I've been many places. Morocco. Now I'll tell you something that not many people know. The Morocco part of it, most other places, now I've gone to like the Dominican Haiti border, the Mexican Guatemala border, the Guatemalan Honduran border, the Jordan Syrian border, the Kenya Tanzania border, to name a few. The Moroccan border, I was actually on my honeymoon and I had like we were in Morocco and so we went to Ceuta, right? Ceuta for a day. So I went there, and it was a very interesting experience because we got rented a taxi to go there, and I just got out and I started taking
maybe just mention that Ceuta is a small Spanish enclave. Yes. On the territory of Morocco. It's gone, but so it's not well known, and it's interesting to know of those two enclaves, Ceuta and Melilla.
Yeah, that is a super important point. And so it's an enclave seemingly in Morocco, but it's a Spanish territory. And so you get there, we got there and I just started taking pictures. And all of a sudden I was surrounded by all these security officials, and they wanted me to erase my picture. It was just of a port of entry. It was like if you go to the crossing near Plattsburgh, it was as if you get out and you just take some pictures there. That's kind of what it looked like, cars going through these toll booths. But I just remember, we were on our honeymoon and started taking pictures and all of a sudden I heard, hey, and then all of a sudden there was hey, what are you doing? And we were surrounded and we started walking back to the taxi, and we got into the taxi, into the cab, and the taxi driver looked at us. But besides that, we went up and were able to see the wall, the wall that surrounds Ceuta, and the watchtowers that were with apparently guards stationed on them, and yeah, so it became, and on top of that, on the road, we were coming from Tangier, so on the road from Tangier to Ceuta, there were so many people on the side of the road coming. I got, I think, and I know that people are coming from places in sub-Saharan Africa that seemed like they were camped out, but right along the side of the road. So I was wondering, wow, this is, well, we got a really good look at kind of the border apparatus from a European perspective on the continent of Africa, right? And that's just, it's interesting how, borders and how they manifest in many different places, often in different ways. And certainly that was the way it was manifesting there. Is very similar to the U.S. Mexico border, I thought, except with the differences with like watchtowers and those sorts of elements. But looking into the technology aspect of it as well, very similar, the command and control centers and the border guard, the Spanish border guard, I believe, sitting there, looking at the monitors and looking at different things.
It's interesting to see that wherever you've got barriers or walls, surprisingly enough, it doesn't seem enough. And you've got all those technology watchtowers, and you were speaking about robots and cameras. You've walked me through the Arizona desert, actually showing me those cameras.
Yeah.
And when you were in Israel, actually, you saw people jumping the wall, literally, right?
Yes, I did. Driving in Jerusalem, heading towards Ramallah, heading towards the West Bank. And we were just driving along, and lo and behold, right in front of us, two men were scaling down the wall on from the Palestinian side to the from one side of Jerusalem to the other, over the wall. And they dropped down pretty much almost onto the highway, but on the little shoulder on the highway. And seeing that right before my eyes, our eyes, I was with some colleagues, was another surprising thing.
So is that what leads you to the idea that maybe we should look at the world in a different way, and maybe without borders?
It does think that. I have one person that I profile, a Palestinian artist named Khaled Jarrar in actually the previous book, Empire of Borders, but I do believe I mentioned him also in Build Bridges Not Walls. But he, like William, looking at the wall and thinking that it could be a bike. As an artist, his one of the things that he did, to give you an example, is he took a sledgehammer to that very concrete wall where those two men were scaling and jumping over, just very much in that same area, because he's from Ramallah. And but what he did was he'd go for five minutes a day for a while and just smashed the sledgehammer. So he has video of it. You can look it up, the video of him smashing the concrete wall, and then getting the shards of the cement, and then eventually getting tons of it and melting it down. And then, just like what your question, looking at the world in a different way, precisely in that very spirit, he melts down the cement shards and then starts to have sculptures as an artist. And one of the sculptures that he did was while he was doing this project, he talked to some kids on the West Bank, Palestinian kids who lost their soccer field due to the wall. And so it was symbolically to give back that the soccer ball. He made a sculpture of a soccer ball in cleats. But to me, while that's art, right? That art, or even William saying what he says, it's still this ability to look at something and think that it can be something else. And that's precisely what I do in the book, right? Like it doesn't have to be the wall. It could be the budget, right? You could look at the budgets, those budgets that are, ending up $55 billion in contracts to private companies to build surveillance equipment. It could be that all that money could be spent differently. I mean, I think this is one of the points I make in the book. Why are we spending it on this when it could be spent on that? If we're really serious about well-being of humanity, right? The well-being of people. The walls, if you look at the walls and look at what they're doing and what they're causing, they're not fomenting well-being, right? It's precisely the opposite. They're like what on the U.S. Mexico border, we talk a lot about border security, right? So that word security is put out there, or customs and border protection. So it's protection. And then when you see how they operate, how the walls operate, how the surveillance system operates, how the agents operate all in tandem, it's to make things as unsafe as possible for people, right? So that it's to promote insecurity, causing people to go through the desert where they might not have enough water, or even people that live in the area like the Tonatan, who have to go through a checkpoint every time they leave the reservation, or people that live in a small towns on the border that if they go to the doctor's office, they have to go through a checkpoint. Those, or fear they're going to get pulled over, or people being fearing that they will get pulled out of their cars. So this idea of security is a bit of a, right, this idea that's fomenting well-being. The exact opposite plays out in the borderlands, right? And so why can't this money, if you look at budgets or look at it, like, why can't, I know I'm looking from a money perspective, you can look at so many different ways, but from that money perspective, why can't it be spent in many different, like right now we have the Glasgow Climate Summit, right? And talking about things like climate finance and helping vulnerable countries adapt to climate change in places that are there's especially facing sea level rise or desertification or different phenomenon that might make places uninhabitable, right? And why can't there be money could, instead of building walls, it could go into something that would help a country be able to adapt, or dare I say, in places where people are going to be forced, where sea level rise is happening, help people relocate, help invest in the places where people are going to. And so that takes away that whole argument, like, oh, we can't do this. Well, what if we took the money, the billions of dollars you were building up your border with, and putting it to a city in a country that's probably going to receive a lot of people because of climate change, right? I'm just naming a couple examples, but there's so many ways you can look at these things, or in this case, these budgets, and think, wow, if we're really about protection and we're really about security, well, then why are we spending it here when we could be spending it there where it might be much better?
I'd like to remind everyone that you can ask your questions en français or in English. Les questions sont bienvenues au fur et à mesure. On les prendra comme c'est une conversation. I would also like to mention that, as you say on page 43, the security market, the global Homeland Security market, was $300 billion in 2014, and it is expected to expand to $846.5 billion in 2025. So it's a massive increase. And indeed, we could imagine that money could go even in Central America, where the impact of climate change, you've talked about that in your previous book, but will put more and more people on the move. So do you see concrete things we could do with that money in Central America, which you know well, by the way?
Yeah, I mean, Central America is a really great example, and that money, like, for example, that there's, when you're thinking about in terms of climate change, or I should mention this just to say, this sort of displacement that we're seeing in around the world, of course, but in Central America is rising, and disaster induced displacement, which climate scientists say will have climate change has a lot to do with these disasters, right? And you're seeing a whole area, a swath of territory that's been called the dry corridor, where that's inhabited by many subsistence farmers who no longer can rely on the rains, right? Like and what's interesting to me too is doing research on climate change in places like Central America. You talk to people and say, "Oh, do people know about climate change in rural Central America?" I'm like, more than anyone else, right? Because the small farmers there know exactly what's going on with the soil, know exactly the precision of what's going on there, and when the rains are there's like what were called farmers almanacs for every single community, when they know when to plant, know when the rains come, know when they can rely on the harvest. And that's all been blown out of the water in the last 10 years, or I should say not just the last 10 years, but increasingly so in the last 10 years. And so people can't, farmers, communities in the dry corridor spanning from Guatemala to Honduras to El Salvador and beyond, southern Mexico as well, they can't rely on the rains anymore in any consistent fashion. And so, like last year, for example, I started reading a report on the drought. Like the story of last year in Central America was the hurricanes at the end of the year. These 2 Category 4 hurricanes, of course, intensified rapidly. They thought they were going. I think in one of them, people thought, or meteorologists thought, that they were going to be. It was going to be a tropical depression, and then it intensified in the warmer waters in the Caribbean and blasted right into the coast and just left massive devastation. Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala. Some of the pictures, Guatemala, even though it didn't hit the Guatemalan coast, the flooding in Guatemala was so intense that I one picture I just cannot get out of my mind is a picture of a community flooded to the water line, and a church. All you could see is a church steeple coming out of the water line, and like I think in that community, just that community alone, 600 family, 600 people or families. So I think 600 families lost their homes, combined homes and livelihoods in just one small community, one place. And so, like the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, taking Honduras and Guatemala just from last year, they calculated 1.3 million people were displaced due to disaster. So probably the compounding drought and the storm surges and the storms. And so you think like all this. So then you have like lots of people arriving to the U.S. southern border. There's a caravan that came that got some news attention in January, where I think 8,000 Hondurans crossed the border. When people interviewed many of the testimonies from that caravan were talking about being flooded out, having to live under a bridge, their community, not being able to go back to their homes. So there's this impact showing like displacement, and also in this case the movement of people across the border. And they were a lot of the Hondurans were repelled by Guatemalan, kind of a Guatemalan border force, goes into another part of it, right? The extension of the U.S. border and how they were trained. But we could talk about that later. But anyhow, that's a good thing to talk about. That is what they get, right? Instead of like what do you like in these situations, you almost need like some sort of, if a community is bombed or something, you need some sort of reparation to be able to rebuild your community. Like a community that's flooded, it's destroyed. And that's the thing, like why all the money to the border, billions of dollars, like the calculations of U.S. border enforcement from 2003 to present, if you just take CBP and ICE, is about $330 billion has gone to that. And so it's just like, why not, like, very, like, in these sorts of situations, money could be applied to helping communities recover from all this damage, or like flooded communities, like helping to rebuild homes, or just a number of different things. I would think that they would have, well, never mind. But the money, the point of it is the money can be better applied, and that's, I think, Central America is a perfect example. The disasters is one, is, since they're increasing, is an interesting way to look at it.
So I know the answer, but I think it needs to be asked. Do people want to be on the move, or do they want to stay home?
Yeah, I think for the most part, people want to stay home. People do not want to move. And that's, it's interesting. I'm glad you asked that, because in my country, in the way that it's described by the media very often, is that people want to go, they want to come here, here being the United States. They want, and it's like, no, they don't really. Nobody, it's actually the exact opposite. People don't want to come here, right? I mean, it's complicated. So the people that do want to come here is often to reunite with their families that are already here, or there's so much that's happened over the years, and the interconnections are very profound. Like in the borderlands, their family members live on both sides of the border. But the idea that people just jump up and they want to come to the United States for freedom is really ridiculous when you think of what undocumented people have to go through in the United States, and that sort of thing. So it's like in the situation of Central America, of course, people, like in the stuff we just described, people start to do it often. I mean, each person, each family, each community has their different processes to determine, like, and often, families, well, if it's one person that goes from a family, or a couple people, sometimes family members will go to like the capital cities in their countries, like Guatemala City or Tegucigalpa. And but it's often like a decision that's not just hastily made. It's an intimate decision. It's one that takes a lot of deliberation and thought, and people are aware of the dangers. That's often, I say that because the Border Patrol, I meet with them constantly. They'll say, "Oh, nobody knows. They don't know," and it's like, yeah, they actually do know. I mean, the information comes by word of mouth. There's so many experiences of so many people crossing the border, and the dangers are known. Of course, people get deceived here and there. That does happen, but the fact that it's a dangerous journey, everyone does know that. And so to do that, it takes, and people don't want to do it because, like your original question, like who wants to do that? Who wants to risk their lives crossing a border, leave the place they love, their family members, their community members, their friends, what they know, their language they speak, the food they eat, to go and maybe get, risk their lives crossing a border, and then maybe get some awful job, right? That they were, it's like people, yeah, that, so I don't know. I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree with you. And it leads me to maybe something you mentioned about the U.S. Border Patrol being a frontline instrument of white supremacist power. Rhys Jones has just published White Borders, which builds also on that. But you mentioned that it has been an instrument of white supremacist power since its founding in 1924. Could you maybe elaborate on history and maybe tell us how you see that, like, every day in your borderlands?
Sure. And first, I would definitely recommend Rhys Jones's new book, like you mentioned, geographer Rhys Jones, from the University of Hawaii, and his book White Borders. It really takes an in-depth look at that, of these aspects, the racist, racialized aspects of U.S. border building, and then the origin of the U.S. Border Patrol in 1924. And Jones starts with this Chinese exclusion laws in the United States in the 1880s. I think it was 1883. and just showing how you're discriminating, these immigration laws discriminate against particular groups of people, and how that's, follows it through the 20th century, the early 20th century, the immigration laws of I believe 1920 and 1924, and the precise language in these precise, very discriminatory language, and also, besides being racist, it's also classist and also ableist, right? Like I believe people with disabilities are also going to be screened at the border. Public health issues, like the whole thing of people being checked for disease, and those sorts of things, and how it comes from the eugenics, right? The eugenics process. And then lo and behold, when these sort of immigration laws are passed with all these stipulations, on comes the U.S. Border Patrol, as part and parcel of all this in 1924 when it was created. And so I highly recommend Jones's book, to show this whole aspect of it. And it can't be so, it's now you take it to, you look through the history, like one of the biggest operations in the pre-modern period of the U.S. border apparatus was like Operation Wetback, which Wetback, completely derogatory term. The whole operation was named in this way by the U.S. Border Patrol. I believe it was in 1953. That was this mass roundup and deportation of people. So that, those sorts, like using that sort of terminology, and the fact that Border Patrol uses that sort of terminology now, wetback, quote unquote, has turned to other terms. They use it. In my research, like you talk to agents and you ask them, do they use any derogatory terms? And they'll say yes, right? Like one of them is tonk, which is T-O-N-C or T-O-N-K, and that's like a term, tonk, it's called. It's a term that's used pretty widely in the Border Patrol, and it's been for a couple decades. It's still to this day. And if you can, I know this because every once in a while you get text messages that agents will send released for public view, or emails or different things that indicate, you see that they're using that word. And the word itself describes the sound that flashlight makes when it's hitting somebody on the head, right? So it's a violent act against somebody crossing a border. And then I don't know how you can't look at the border. Well, of course, then now you have this last 4 years before Biden, of course, you had the Trump administration, which is completely hit the racist card on the border time and time and time again, right? And in fact, central to Trump's campaign in 2016, his presidency, and then his attempted campaign in 2020, or his campaign. He wasn't attempted, he did campaign. There was the border, right? And the idea of the border and stopping these people from crossing, right? And the border itself, of course, it separates. It's interesting because the border actually separates. It's cut through where there's lots of community ties and familial ties, but at the same time, when you in the terms of countries, it comes down and separates a disproportionately white country from a disproportionately country of color, right, and indigenous. And so you have I don't know how you don't look at like the 30-foot wall, or even the 15 or 20-foot wall, or even the vehicle barriers of the Border Patrol, and how it's aimed at in this way, and not like sense this history that goes back to the Chinese exclusion and throughout the last more than a century, and not see that how it manifests today.
It is true. And when we look at Philippe Rekasevich maps, he shows that the barriers between North and South are actually like the Great Wall between two worlds, and it's between two colors often. That leads me to something you mentioned. You referred Geoff Boyce that argues that Border Patrol should be abolished. What's your take on that? Should we abolish the Border Patrol and ICE or ICE?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. In both cases. Yes. And really for all the reasons that we've mentioned up to this point, right? Or you could just take an economic reason. The money simply can be better spent. Even if if it's, there's a lot of conversation, I'm assuming in Canada as well, in the United States, about the police, right? But the border, even regardless of even what you think about that, right? The Border Patrol is this, it's about boundary enforcement and has little to do with if my house gets robbed, if somebody comes into my house, I don't call the Border Patrol, right? And not to get into that other discussion, I just wanted to say it's the idea of the Border Patrol, ICE of course is part and parcel of the Border Patrol in immigration and customs enforcement, right? And it's a lot of the interior enforcement, but also mainly the deportation apparatus, the detention, incarceration, and then the deportation. And it seems like to abolish the Border Patrol, to and thinking about what their policies that they're enforcing cause, and then abolishing ICE, which same thing, and then you free up the money to be spent in much better ways. I have I've mentioned this in the book. There's a professor that brought this idea to me from Prescott College, who has an exercise that she does with her class, that she says, well, imagine if the Border Patrol could be turned into gardeners, right? And you turn the border between the U.S. and Mexico into a garden. and it's a very interesting thing. What if, right? Why not? The border itself, the border wall now, it's now has coiling razor wires. It's anything but inviting, anything but beautiful. But why can't we start to reframe what this is? Why? And then in terms of the climate turmoil, of course, gardeners might be much more needed for human security reasons. There's the tree planting research that's been done. What if the Border Patrol could go and plant? What if your job every day was to go plant one tree? And that would be 20,000 trees planted every day, right? so if in 15 years you could, you maybe, as it sequesters carbon from the atmosphere, perhaps, the point is that there could be money, again, like turning the border wall into bikes, or turning the concrete wall in Palestine to sculptures. It could, the Border Patrol might be a misuse of human energy, and it could be just used in much better ways for everyone, and everyone in the United States, everyone outside of the United States. It could create a more beautiful environment for people in general, regardless of the border. And so, yes, I do think, when you think of one more point, when you think of abolition, oftentimes abolition is thought of as only one part of it, get rid of the Border Patrol, get rid of ICE, right? Or get rid of the border wall, abolish the border wall. But the other part of it is that, okay, it frees up all these people and all this money to do something else, and to think of something else, and to imagine something else, and perhaps imagine a better world. And I think that is another really important part of it.
And I think we should mention at that stage the work done by Ronald Rael, who is an architect and has written a superb book on the border wall as architecture. And he has done very recently those famous pink seesaws at the at the El Paso Ciudad Juarez border, and he's trying indeed to see the once again the world, and for instance the border wall in a different manner. So I think it's interesting to mention his work. I hear you, Todd, but you live in a country where the migration agenda and the border agenda is basically defined by conservatives. Like they have almost the monopoly of the discussion, the GOP. So your ideas make sense, but how can we convince them? Would you be able to convince them that this is a good move? Because those people, it's been built on fear for so many years. So how do we walk back what has been done? How do we change the public agenda, the public discourse? How do we do that?
Yeah, that is the question. I think some major I know, from writing all these books and doing what I do, and like last week I was in Denver, the week before I was in New York State, traveling around within the United States and talking about these issues to different places. It's amazing to me, that how many people just don't know what's going on, like the unpacking of it, understanding what this is. It seems to me that like there's certain sectors that are like the Trump and his constituency, right? That sector is definitely convinced about what needs to be done, and it's all about building up borders. And then there's a whole swath of people in the United States that just don't really know what's going on. So the kind of rhetoric, the kind of words used, like security, protection, those words go a long way, right? And I think like unpacking those sorts of things so people understand how much budgets are going into it. And actually, like when people know, whereas the conservative sectors in the US, like you can never, like the Trump administration, you couldn't pressure the Trump administration to do anything along these lines. But the Democrats could be pressured, right? What the Democrats tend to do is they just keep doing it. A lot of times, like a Trump administration will come in and or like you could take the George W. Bush administration post 9/11, this massive enforcement increase, and then the Obama administration came into power, and it was a status quo by then, and you just keep doing it. And even increasing it, not as much as the Bush administration, but maintaining it and increasing it. And I think those sectors, the Democrats, particularly via the Democratic progressive wing, there's points of pressure that can be I think one of the biggest examples of the pressure too was during the family separation issue in 2018, when people saw the television cameras captured like mothers and fathers being ripped away from their children, and that sort of brutality that happens on the border. And of course, Trump was taking it to the extra level and then wanting to have it on camera. But that brutality is, when the cameras turned away, the brutality was still there. It still is here. And if people could see that, and then there was more of a groundswell, like in 2018, when people saw that, there was a groundswell that actually forced Trump to stand before the country and say, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. Even though we know he kept doing it, right? Not as much, but he kept doing it, but he had to stand up there. And that was because of pressure. And I think that that sort of pressure, from that political point of view, for political influence point of view, is one way. I also think that the private part, the industry part of it, that does when budgets are being talked about, there's all kinds of lobbying that happens behind closed doors, talking. A lot of these companies getting big contracts have the ability to give campaign contributions. That aspect of it needs to be, there has to be an awareness of that and a reckoning with that, because that keeps it on like the growth, a growth pattern as well. Yeah, I don't know. It's a hard one it's a hard thing to answer because it's so entrenched in a certain direction. And it seems like the work is now, like your work, like the work that you do in UQAM or the University of Quebec in Montreal with the students, your work is so invaluable. And your work, Elizabeth, in like showing like what is going on in the world, I think goes a long way. It's super important. And I think there could be like awareness shifts. I think one last thing with climate change too, and showing those connections, and instead of having siloed issues, when we see them, oh, okay, climate does have to do with this, and this is a response to that. Can't we have another response? When you start posing questions like that, I think new questions, new framings, all that stuff, and pressure could do something. I'm a little bit pessimistic, but I try to get this last book was probably my most optimistic book. And I really it was a really kind of game changer for me in terms of my outlook on this. And I'm like looking at things constructively and trying to figure out like what to do.
Which is difficult indeed, because when we've seen those Haitians arriving in Laredo in Texas, and the images, and as every caravan that has come to the border, it's been over shown in the media. So there is that feeling, and we get that here and there in Canada, a lot in Europe, that there are those waves of migrations. Mm-hmm. And so how can we counter the power of those images and advocate for the reallocation of resources, because that's basically what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's so I'm working on a new project called the Border Chronicle. I think you mentioned it in your introduction, and we wrote quite a bit on the situation that you just mentioned in Haiti. And my colleague who I'm doing this with, Melissa Dobosque, she wrote a piece about the media and what she called it. I think the pieces had another name, but the central theme of it was border theater, and looking at the border theater of the media and how it was portrayed, and how, exactly as you said, characterized as people coming in waves, but without any sort of other context. And how in this case, where she was looking particularly at how Fox News was covering it, to the point where she got into a dispute with a Fox News reporter, who then trolled her, and she had to deal with comments coming, hundreds, thousands even of comments, because of this article, which is unfortunately one of the Twitter things you have to deal with. Anyhow, that sort of understanding how things are portrayed. And I think Melissa does a good job in her article on this, understanding how things are portrayed and how it foments how policy is made, right? Like you say waves, and these people, the otherizing language, and the language of criminals, like there's other waves coming there. And then she connected it with, in this case, Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas's campaign. And he was actually using that as part of his campaign to then justify building up the border more, bringing more resources, and that sort of thing. And so, yeah, it's hard. And then the Democrats, right? The other side of the spectrum, like the Biden administration comes into this and says, well, we're gonna, they said, some things, that we're going to ban horses, right? And that made a lot of news. And that's right. That's what that becomes you know, you have I'm sorry, I forgot to give context. The banning the horses is, of course, the imagery of a border patrol agent taking the reins of and then whipping towards people at the river, at the Rio Grande, and people, you know, so it has, you know, those images, and the response is, well, not that the border patrol and the whole thing is in fact a very violent apparatus, and that's what it's meant to be. It's more, oh, we're going to ban the horses, right? So it's a cosmetic change rather than a change that's also in the response to this media thing, and it just gets caught up in there when it seems like the understanding has to go much deeper, including understanding how people from Haiti arrived there to begin with. What are their journeys? What is going on? What are U.S. policies? What U.S. policies are involved in maybe causing some displacement in different places? There's a whole array of things that just are not talked about. And it seems like the conversation definitely has to shift. The media, I think the media just sets it in a certain framing, and it's so difficult to get out of it. And that's why we're writing the Border Chronicle, right? Trying to get these new angles and looking at it in these new ways.
Todd Miller, I would recommend reading all the books, but let's start with this one. It's a fantastic one. Thank you very much, Todd. C'était un plaisir de te recevoir aujourd'hui. Et merci à tout le monde d'avoir assisté à cette conférence. On me signale qu'il est 13h59. Il me reste 30 secondes pour remercier la chaire Raoul-Dandurand et les différentes personnes qui sont derrière cette organisation. And once again, merci beaucoup, Todd. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thanks to everyone.